Okay, hi everybody. My name is Doug Brown. You might have seen me around on some of the chat channels in the Grow with Google program for the past few months, and very happy to be able to do this program for everyone today with the restaurant project, Project One. Just a quick bit about me, so you're like, why is this guy giving this presentation? I've been with the program since the beginning. When we were doing the challenge course first, I thought the challenge course was really good. And so I was able to get my staff at work involved in doing a React training program as well. And I took that along with them before we dove into doing this particular program. My background is actually in human factors psychology. I've been in the digital industry for a while. And so all of the programming that I've done has been self-taught. I really come from what nowadays is called the UX discipline, and I've been a UX architect essentially for a lot of my career, but I've jumped back and forth between doing development and design several times throughout the course of things, going from designing CD-ROMs and applications for databases to learning how to implement those things so I could have better conversations with developers, and going into multimedia and doing multimedia work for a long time, working on CD-ROM titles, and eventually starting to work on web stuff. The important thing to know about me here, though, like I said, is I'm self-taught with everything. And I really hadn't touched anything to do with JavaScript in over 3 years before taking this course this year. But I do have a lot of, fundamentals in programming. So all of the things that we've learned in this course were new to me. Everything with service workers. I'd touched Flexbox a bit before. Things like Fetch was completely new. I hadn't used any of that before. So I got hands-on along with all the rest of you guys too. But I did pick up some of the stuff faster just because of my background, I think. So based on another class that was done for one of the other tracks, we wanted to model this one similarly. And so what I thought we could do is sort of walk through the thought process that I followed to finish this project off. I have graduated from the nano degree program, and so I'm doing all of this kind of in hindsight. So I thought the approach that we could take would be something like this. Share my screen real quick. Nope. So I thought what we could do is kind of take it the way that I took it. I can give you sort of how I approached everything from a thinking process and how I looked at the layout. And so start with design. And design for me is all about looking at the base layout of the page, where we are, figuring out where I want to go with things, how do I want the page to flow, and how do I want to order those items on the page, and then how do I want to populate the images, making sure I know that, what all I want to put where and that I've got it all set up correctly. Once I got through design, then I moved on to accessibility, worrying a little more about DOM organization and the labeling and the hierarchy of things so that we would get all of the accessibility rules passed in the rubric. And then finally, I did offline accessibility. Offline accessibility really isn't dependent on any of these other things being done. So I left it for last, and there's actually not a whole lot to it. The thing that I'll say as we dive in is that when you start a project, it sounds really simple, but just begin at the beginning of things. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't overthink it too much. Look at where you are, get an idea for where you want to go, and then break it down into the steps that it's going to take to get there. Start small and work on a piece at a time, and then the pieces will come together and make the whole thing. Remember, when you're working on these rubrics, that you don't need to deliver more than what is being asked for, though it's often rewarding to do something more than what is asked for. And we're encouraged to do that. This is a learning opportunity. But at the end of the day, in this project and in the real world too, people are going to ask for certain things to be done. They're going to pay for those things. And you're going to want to move on and work on the next project that's going to be paying for things too. So don't spend more time doing things than you need to. All right, with that being said, let's take a look at what we start off with. So this is the restaurant reviews listing that they give us out of the box with this project. It's kind of hideous. There's a lot wrong with this page. The first thing I thought when I opened it up was, there's some good skeletal stuff to work with, but it's definitely not laid out in a way that's going to be pleasant for users, and we're going to want to do something about that. The first place I always look when I start to approach something like this is going in and doing an inspect on the page, and specifically starting to tear apart the elements. So, I start up at the top and I look at the restaurant reviews, and I see that we've got it in an H1 tag. It's up in this header element, which is wrapped inside of a nav element, which has an H1. So might be a little overly complicated, but it's not necessarily terrible. Then we have the main body, which seems to be wrapping everything somehow, which is a little weird, especially since the header isn't even inside of this. Our map component is, the header's up here. Main content's wrapping everything else. Our map component is inside of that. That doesn't seem too bad. This section kind of has everything else. Both our filter options and our restaurants list, probably not what we want to do with it, because like I said, think about pieces and how you want to approach it a bit at a time. A few rules that I follow from design is think in boxes. I started doing this when I began learning programming, and especially when I started thinking in more object-oriented terms. Didn't necessarily think of things as boxes, but more as people. What's this person's role? What do they do for everybody? And so they take a piece of information from this other guy and they do some transforms on it and they hand it off to somebody else. In layout, it's very similar, where I have a thing and its responsibility is this, and it works in conjunction with some other guys, and together they're making a page. So if we think of all the pieces that way, we're going to want to know what's in each box, how are all the boxes relating to each other, and because we want to do responsive, how are all these things going to resize relative to the viewport? We're also going to want to know more about our images, and I'll cover this real quick here, although we won't get to the images for a few minutes. But what we're really doing is managing what I'm going to call a low-rent DAM, or digital asset manager. If you're not familiar with digital asset managers are, just real quickly, they're basically a cloud service, or they might even be hosted on site, but the more popular ones are cloud-based, where you can put all of your assets for your company, the things you use for print, the things you use for digital, you can shove them all up there, the high-res, high-fidelity versions of them, and then dynamically serve whatever version of it you want. So if I want to have a small thumbnail version of that giant image that's stored out there, in my URL, I put a query string for the source on that image, and the server returns that version of the image. So it takes all the file weight out of it, turns it into a JPEG or a GIF or a PNG or whatever I want it to be. So what we're doing here is kind of pre-working some of that, having some multiple copies of the images, and managing our own on a small scale. But for large enterprise projects, you wouldn't really do it this way, but the fundamentals are important to understand. You don't want to ever load anything bigger than you're actually going to show. So getting our design layout figured out first is going to make a big difference here. Right now, we're just viewing this thing locally. So if the images are larger than they need to be, it's not really hurting anything. But ultimately, we're going to want to make sure that those images don't take up any more physical size than we're ever going to display. And so that's where we're going to make sure that we don't design anything bigger than it actually needs to be. So if we go back here and look at what we've got, we know we're going to want to do something about this section where these two things are stacked together, because they don't really serve connected. They're related, but they're not the same thing. And if we look at things like this image, the image here is actually being displayed at 270 by 248. But it's actually an 800 by 600 image. And there are a couple of things about that. One, you'll notice that we're loading in a much bigger image than we need to display in this particular setting. The other thing is that our aspect ratio is wrong. If you look at this image, everything seems a little squished horizontally and stretched vertically compared to, in this small thumbnail here, you can see the aspect is a little wider than taller. So that's something that we can fix when we're going in and adjusting the layout for everything and make it look a little better. The other thing too about this restaurant list is this is an unordered list, which is fine. List items, LIs, are always going to, by default, just display in a single column. And that's not necessarily what we want here, because from a responsive standpoint, this page really isn't doing anything other than resizing the map. As a matter of fact, everything just kind of disappears. So give you a preview of what I wound up creating with this page, and then we can dive into a little bit of how I restructured the code. So this is how I wound up making the page in the end. And I'll turn on the inspector here. And you can see that if I resize it, we switch from a 3-up grid to a 2-up grid. And as I scale down, it switches to a single width grid. So we have a nice responsive display. It's going to work well on things like mobile handsets or tablets or even desktop. The other thing that I did though too is you'll notice that beyond a certain width, it just doesn't grow anymore. And I'm having blank space added on either side evenly and centering the display in the middle. Like I said, my original background is in UX architecture, and people naturally have kind of a limit, and I think we might have covered this in the course, but they have kind of a limit to how far they want to scan left to right before it starts to get uncomfortable or hard to track how much information is on the page. So beyond a certain width, I usually keep my displays to a maximum size, and then just let the page pad out from there. And so I felt that that would work well with this display. Really a design choice, or more ideally, if you can do studies with users and learn from them exactly what they like and what they don't like, what's working well or not well for them, and what's helping drive the conversion rates for your traffic on your website, because that's always going to be the most important outcome that you're looking for. So let's go into a little bit of the code. And I'm going to use Beyond Compare. Beyond Compare is kind of cool. There are other tools out here that do the same thing. But like I said, since I've already done this, I won't step through and try to rebuild the pages in real time. What we can do instead is look at the changes that I did make compared to what we were given. So for instance, if we look at the index.html file, which drives this page, you can see the file isn't particularly long. And honestly, I didn't make too many changes to this page aside from some formatting and adding a few things. So you can see, like with the H1 here, and I just did some prettier formatting using Visual Studio Code. One item that I did add that you're going to need to make things responsive appropriately across viewport sizes is added the meta tag for the viewport with the content width of device width and initial scale of 1. This will make sure that we're looking good across phones, tablets, and that we're using device-independent pixels. I've also added a script here for registering our service worker, which we'll get to later. I have a few things that we'll touch on in here when we get to talking about accessibility with our ARIA labeling. I did break out our filter results. I took the selects and wrapped them in their own div for filter selects. And then the restaurant list is in its own UL still. And then of course we have our maps and we have our footer. And again, this is just formatting. So I didn't change too much on this page. I added a div, I added a viewport tag, and then the rest is all going to be in the JavaScript and CSS files. And really there aren't too many changes in the JavaScript file either. You can see that I can go through most of the JavaScript file for the main page, and there aren't any changes in it at all. But when we get down to the images, I did make some changes here, and we'll cover those in a few more minutes. So let's jump over to the CSS file. The CSS file is where most of the changes are going to happen, by and large, for what we're doing in this entire project. Again, a lot of prettier formatting just to make the file a little more readable. Here's the first change that I made. Remember, I mentioned that there's a max width beyond which the page is not going to continue to expand its content. And I set that here. And I made the max width 1100 pixels. And by making the margin left and margin right auto, they're going to keep themselves evenly distributed and center the content. Again, this is a design preference. Everyone's free to do whatever they like with this. That's one of the nice things about this project. With a lot of projects, like I said, I did the React course earlier this year. I finished this one. I'm currently about halfway through the Android Nano degree now. This one allows you a lot more creativity than a lot of the other projects in some of the other programs do. And that's one of the things to take advantage of here. Learn to use some of the tools that aren't necessarily being asked of, just to do some more interesting things with the design. We'll get to a few color choices that I made here when we talk about accessibility as well. So for the main content, you'll see that from a display perspective, what I've done is I've changed this to display flex. If you remember, main content is this section. It's covering everything with the map and the restaurant list and the filter results, all of that. I have turned that into a column ordered flex layout. And so that means that any elements within that flex display are going to stack top to bottom, one at a time in a single column. So this is where I was saying, think about things as boxes. In this case, the map is a box because I wrapped this filter in a div. Now it's treated as a box. This UL is treated as a box as well. And so all of these things are going to stack together if we look at how I've laid it out here. So, here I did leave these two in the section together. It's been a little bit since I looked at the code. But these things are all going to stack on top of each other vertically now. And the CSS is just going to take care of that for us. If you look at the navigation, I made a few changes here just from a layout perspective. Again, these are more aesthetic, but the aesthetics always help. Several years ago, when I was doing my first job out of college, I was doing usability, and I did a study in conjunction with a professor out of Ohio State University, where we were looking at the effects of design and usability and how visual design and usability had impact on each other. And I mean, there have been other studies since then, I'm sure, that may have more definitive results. But this at least is an initial showing that that both visual design and usability have impact on each other. And that's important when you consider that we're also doing accessibility in this particular project. So if you can get things to lay out a little cleaner, to look a little cleaner, and be a little simpler on the page doing so, that's going to make it a whole lot easier to make it accessible as well. In this case, what I got rid of was the hard set height of 80 pixels, which causes things to basically get stretched in weird ways, using space that we don't need, not laying things out in a nice, even flow. For our H1 in the nav, I also added some padding at the top and bottom, again, just so we'd have some nicer spacing and some better readability. And I also changed our font size, just, again, for readability and accessibility. The breadcrumb layout I changed as well, so that, and again, we might be looking at a different page, but the breadcrumb, I changed some of the layout as well, just to simplify the layout. And yeah, breadcrumbs on the detail page, so apologize. For restaurant filtering, made a few changes here. If you remember, for the restaurant filtering here, this is kind of sitting outside of its bounding area. It's a little hard to read. Definitely looks strange. Wanted to make it a little cleaner, give some nice buffer space around it, make sure that we have something that's easy to look at. And so I changed our padding here and got rid of the hard set height so that we're not making bad assumptions about how much space we need. Unless you really know how big something's going to be, which I do some of in here, generally setting a hard height or a hard width is going to lead to problems unless you've made some very specific design choices. So that's where we come into the restaurant listing. You'll see here that, again, I left what was already in place the same, but I made some changes and I turned the restaurant listing into a flex display, this time by row. So it's going to display left to right. It's going to wrap from row to row to fill in all the content until we run out of content. And I center justified that as well. So that means that when we get to the last restaurant on the page, it's going to appear in the middle. The LIs, the list items, I then also largely kept what was here, made a couple changes. I figured out for my visuals exactly what I wanted the padding to be. And I figured out my min width and max width. So my min width is the same as the original width, but the max width, having a little bit of flex between those two numbers, now means that things can scale horizontally as the browser size is changed. And then I've added my media queries. So if I'm at a mid width of 0 pixels, then all of my restaurant items are going to go full width. It'll be a single column at that point. Once I get to a 714 pixel width, and it's very specific, they go to 45%, which leaves a bit of a gutter between them, and I get 2 pixels up. And then once I go to above 1032 pixels, I've set them to a max width of 300 pixels. So they have a hard and fast width at that point, and it gets me exactly the layout that I'm wanting at that size. I've also, for the images inside of each restaurant item, specified exactly or taken out the specification for the min height. The min height was causing that weird behavior with the aspect ratio and causing it to stretch. And because now I've constrained using my media queries and my restaurant list item, how big I'm going to make all of those spaces, I'm just going to let the restaurant image fill them up. And as long as I've got all the restaurant images the same aspect ratio, then they should all show nice and even in that grid. I've also set some extra items here for the text area inside each of those grid cards so that I know exactly how big all of the text display is going to be, because I want each of those to look nice and even and not have staggered heights where I've got unevenly sized cards all over the screen, because that just doesn't look as good to me. Then we have a few accessibility changes in here, and I also made the filter selects area a flex display just to keep things nice and consistent. The other thing that that does for us too is if I take this page and I squeeze it way down, it means that now my filters will automatically wrap around each other. And so now I've got, even on an older iPhone, a nice display that's going to scroll top to bottom and let me see everything without having to do anything weird. So that covers the main restaurant display. So if we switch over to, and I know I'm going really fast, but I do want to make sure we have time for questions starting in about 15 minutes. So if I click over to view details, one thing I want to call out, if you notice, this is a little more square the way I have the image here. And when I go to the details, again, from an aesthetic perspective, I made it more of a widescreen image, which means I did crop the top and bottom off for these detail pages. The reason I did that was just so we could pull content higher above the fold, so that when you go to a view like this, instead of having half of your screen be all of this image and pushing other important information down, you have more information on your device. Again, totally an aesthetic choice. The restaurant reviews screen that we were given originally, really not attractive. Things overlap each other in weird ways. Footer hanging out here. Weird stuff happening with how the map overlaps and doesn't overlap other things. And what we really want, or at least what I wanted, was something that looked more like this. And even in this space, I made this map really narrow, still stretching out the horizontal space, but vertically, I made it pretty short just to give you enough context so you could see where it is, your hours information, and then your reviews. So again, if we go back and look at the restaurant details screen, you'll see that didn't change too much again. Added the viewport, added the JavaScript for registering the service worker, made changes for the breadcrumb that we'll talk about for accessibility, made a couple of other accessibility changes on here as well, and then did a lot of work on updating the section for the restaurant address and hours, and pretty much it. Everything else stayed a lot the same. And again, I updated this section just to make it flow a little better from a DOM perspective to provide some better structure for the CSS. If we look at the restaurant info JS file, not too much has changed in here either. Again, when I did pretty on the pretty formatting with Visual Studio Code, it did things like take out some unnecessary parentheses, switch from single quote to double quote. So that's where you see some of the differences here. They're really not meaningful code differences. I changed how I built the images, and I did that on both pages, and I'll cover that more here in a minute. And filling in the details for the hours, again, mostly just pretty formatting, not too much change from what was in there before. I did, because there was some extra spacing appearing on things because of the data in the JSON file, I added some trim functions to some of the strings. And really, aside from that, I didn't do too much more. Added a few classes, but again, that's just so we can get some better CSS formatting. And fixed up some items with the breadcrumb navigation, but that's accessibility, and we'll talk about in a minute. So let's look through the CSS, and then I'll explain what I did with the images. If we look at the restaurant details, a lot of things, again, didn't change too much. I did totally comment out this inside header section because that has a fixed position, and that's what's causing some of the stuff to slam off to the one side of the page and not stretch across appropriately, and it's acting all funny. I just want it to be where it is. Same thing with position fixed here and a lot of the formatting on the map container. That's what had it stuck over to the right-hand side. Commented out the same thing with the footer, which was making it stick to the left. So some basic changes just to get the layout to line up a little better. And then I took the classes that I added to some of the new sections or some of the revised sections in the layout and gave them styles for the padding I wanted, font sizes, those kinds of things. Overall, not too many changes to get a pretty dramatic shift in the layout. And again, for things like the hours and the reviews, I switched all of that to being a flex layout. It makes it a lot simpler to manage, and if we want to stretch things, compress them, go to single or double column, there are a lot of things that we can do with that pretty simply. All right, so in terms of the images, I do have both single and double pixel format images in here. Use the same trick for both of them. And basically, I have a base image, and it's be easier if I show in here, I think. So I created, these are the original images that we were provided with. I added a not available image in case restaurant, or in case we're offline trying to get details for a restaurant and we don't have the image already preloaded. But I created single and double pixel format tiles and single and double pixel format banners for the listing and for the details. And just like in the lessons online, they talk about having like _1x and _2x to differentiate them. The nice thing about that kind of file naming convention means that we can take what we know our base file names should be. So the JSON will still say 1.jpg, and I can split those apart and use 1 and add the _1x and then put the JPEG back on. And the same with the 2x. And then I can create my source and my source set. And I know that I don't need anything to be more than 300 pixels wide, because that's the widest my tile will ever be on the restaurant listing page, is 300 pixels. My double size is 600. And so all of my tile images have a consistent aspect ratio. Single size are 300 pixel wide, double size are 600 pixel wide. I'm trying to remember what the file sizes are. I don't think that I have anything, and I'm checking really quick. Yeah, my double pixel image sizes, the biggest one is 59K for the restaurant listing. So you can keep those images really small. The single pixel density are in the 20K range. And that's going to help a lot with our Lighthouse scores too. I did the same trick over here on the restaurant details, but now I'm loading it from the banners. In the DB helper class, I'm taking in a parameter for, find where I put it. Oh, here we go, the image URL for restaurant. Before they were, the function was returning the image path with the file name for the restaurant photo. What I'm doing instead is I'm taking in a parameter for the type of image I want. Do I want the tile or the banner? And I'm building out the URL using that. And then in the restaurant info detail JavaScript, I can split that out, change things around, make it single or double pixel, set my source set, and also set my alternate text, which is just the name of the restaurant plus some restaurant promotional image. And that's what I did there. I've seen some questions recently on the forums or on the Slack channel asking how people are handling alt text. There isn't really a wrong way to handle it, although a lot of your linters and other things will complain at you, like if you're using Visual Studio Code, and they'll say, hey, the image is already the element type and the screen reader is already going to say image. So it's really not useful or helpful to put image in the descriptive text again. It gets redundant and it bothers people. So I left that, or try and leave that out. Here I left it in because I missed it. We all make mistakes. So that covers a lot of what I did with those two pages. The accessibility, flip back to here real quick and just give a few principles on accessibility. I kind of mentioned it a little before, but your page flow is going to account for about 80% of your accessibility. That means make sure your DOM is clean, make sure things are ordered and your hierarchy is good. Put the most important things towards the top of your page and the least important things towards the bottom. Because for someone who needs to navigate using a screen reader, that's a lot to get through in an audio fashion. And if you've ever heard someone who really uses a screen reader, it's kind of intense. And honestly, I don't know how they do it. If you've messed around with Chromevox and some of the others that were mentioned in the lesson, and you see that you've got kind of a speed thing and they show you how you can speed up to like 2 or 3 times, the people who depend on this on a day-to-day basis are cranking that speed up maybe to 10 times or maybe even higher. And it just starts to sound like static to most of us, but to them it's meaningful. And so the less of that kind of content we can force through their pipeline, the easier it's going to be for them to get to the things that matter. Another thing that really matters is your hierarchy with your H tags. A lot of people think that the H tags, H1, H2, H3, just put them anywhere to get the bigger text and the smaller text, and I use them for styling. Believe it or not, at my previous role, prior to working for Academy Sports as the UI engineering manager, I worked for DSW Shoes in the same role, and we were working with a vendor on doing a site update. and they were creating design recommendations that had things inappropriately linked to each other. So they had like an H1 tag inside of an H4 tag. That's going to drive a screen reader and a screen reader user absolutely bananas because stuff is going to jump all over the place and not make any sense. So make sure that you only have one H1 tag on a page, that all of your H2 tags are inside that H1 tag, your H3s are inside of H2s. If you do that, just those few things are going to make a world of difference in the level of accessibility that your site is achieving. And then semantics for your components are really just a mix of good labeling and good affordances. If you want it to be a button, use a button. Don't use a link that looks like a button. Those are the kind of things that also can drive people crazy when they're trying to use your website. So, if we look at, for instance, go back a screen. If we look at the view details, for example, on here, it looks like a button, but it's actually a link. And so these are the kinds of things that you need to check for and make sure that you get set correct. So in this case, I changed them. If it comes back, being fussy. So, but I changed them to buttons. It's fairly straightforward to do that. But those things are honestly riddled throughout the sample code. Make sure you're looking for all of them. So if we take just a quick peek at some of the items that I changed in here. So this would be in main, for instance, where it's being assembled. Down. Trying to remember where the code is. Here we go. So here's create element A, instead create element button. Inner HTML can stay the same, but then instead of an href for your link, now you have to create an onClick function for your button. And instead of appending it to the li, I appended it to the div. Just a change in how I was approaching some of the structure. But these are the sorts of things that need to be in the file. The breadcrumb one in particular, when I first submitted this project, I did get it kicked back because I didn't quite have the breadcrumb correct. Don't be afraid of submitting a project and having it kicked back. I think half of the projects I've done through the 3 different nanodegrees have been kicked back. And usually for 1 or 2 items. And they're usually things that you say, oh yeah, gosh, I totally missed that or forgot it. And you can change it real quick and resubmit it, usually within a couple of hours, and it's not a big deal. So watch for those. Some other accessibility items that we can run through. Again, the H1s, the H2s, the H3s, particularly on the restaurant info, they're wrong. They're just wrong. You need to walk through and make sure you have those. Also look at your font contrast, your colors between foreground and background. Those are definitely off in a number of places. You can find some good online utilities that will help make color recommendations that will pass. If you notice, not that I don't like the kind of orange color on this button here. And if I could get back to, my page, I don't know why I can't get back to it. But if I could get back to it, you would notice that mine is darker. It's not necessarily a color I would usually pick, but I picked it because the difference between the background contrast, the button contrast, and the text color, that was just where I could get it using the default color scheme that we were already on with this particular design. Again, creative opportunity to do something different if you want to. Okay, so the last thing to take a look at before we get into questions is the service worker. So I have a register file. The register file is really pretty simple. We're just going to set up our service worker. If service worker is something that the browser supports, so if service worker in Navigator, then the browser's service worker should register the SWJS file, and once it's registered, then I'm logging out that I successfully registered it. Otherwise, I'm saying I failed, and I'm saying what the error was. So that's pretty straightforward. That has to be on all of the pages in your website. Then the service worker file itself, I'm setting up a cache ID, just like we talked about the course. So if I need to change this entire file at some point, I can update this value. When the listener is installed, or the service worker is installed, then we tell the browser to wait on this thread, because this is actually like a little background application. Service worker, you can think of like a simple web server running inside the user's browser. It's going to take requests to return files, and you're programming how you want it to handle those requests. It doesn't run on the main thread, and as you get into the later classes or the later lessons in the nano degree, they'll talk more about the foreground thread, the background thread, the main thread, and explain that a little more. But just think of this as a separately running application that isn't going to slow down your browser performance for the page. So this is telling this application to wait until we've opened the cache and added all of these items to it. And from there, we're just going to listen for fetch events. And when an event comes in, we are going to look and see if that item is in the cache. And if the item is in the cache, which means the position in our call is greater than -1, then particularly in this case, we're looking at the home page. So if we're looking for the home page, then we will return the one that we have cached. I've added this in here just to kind of get around the CORS issues when I'm developing locally. So if it's running locally, then I'm setting the request mode to no CORS. And then I'm responding to the event by matching requests out of the cache. If it's already in there, I return the response. Otherwise, I'm fetching from the internet what they're looking for using my mini web server in here. I'm going out and getting the original source. Once it comes in, I'm putting it into the cache, and then I'm returning what I got back. Or else if there's an error, I'm telling the user what happened, or at least logging it out so that it can be debugged. So there are a fair number of moving parts in this project, but overall it's really not too bad. Most of it is in your CSS. Most of it is a good combination of making sure that your HTML is structured well, and then you are using CSS to format it to get the kind of result that you want, and getting everything laid out. Oh, look, the page finally came up with these kind of ugly brown buttons that I wound up with. But you've got the page formatted in the way that you want. That's going to be performant and get stuff to the user in a way that's accessible. The Lighthouse score that I came up with for this page, I forget exactly where it was, but it was somewhere in the upper 70s. And that was without doing any additional tuning. And that's just by structuring the page well, getting the image sizes down to being exactly what you need and no bigger. And that helps with the load time a lot. So I think that covers everything that we have to go over code-wise, and that leaves us exactly where we want to be with being able to answer some questions. So I have my lovely assistant, Zoe, helping me with questions from the chat page.
Nobody's really asked any.
Nobody's asked any questions yet. We have a couple. Okay, so can download the slides after. I'll tell you what, I will put the PowerPoint deck up on my GitHub, and you can get it from there. And I will put my GitHub account out. All of this code is on my GitHub too. Just remember, play fair.
Okay.
No plagiarizing.
A couple people did ask some questions just now.
Can you watch this again? Yes, this is going to be posted, and it will be available for viewing later. I'm not sure when Kelsey and the Audacity team are going to have that done, but it should be available before too long.
Okay.
What other questions?
Questions. How can I make menus accessible without visible labels sighted users don't need?
Oh, great. Good question. So let me switch back over here to the code. So how do we make the labels visible without sighted users seeing them? So if we look, let's go back here to, let's go back here to the index file. And if we look at our selects, and you can see what I've done here is I added two labels on, sorry. I added the ARIA labeled by tags. So I said that this one is labeled by the neighborhoods label. And this is the neighborhoods label. So then if I go into the CSS file, I'll look up. Okay. Not sure why. All right, it's in here somewhere. Let's take a second, we'll find it. But basically, where is it? What did I do? Oh, filter label. Okay, it's not liking me looking for that in there. Let me try in here real quick. Look off screen for a second. There we go. Yeah, that's what I thought I did. And I've hidden it. Well, I don't know where it went now. Try to get this back. All right, I don't know where I've hidden the window on myself. Oh, here we go. There. Oh, it was halfway between screens. Weird. Yeah, so then I set the filter label to display none. Screen reader can still find it and read it as part of the ARIA labeling, but the user's not going to see it. So hopefully that helped with that one. Okay, any other questions?
On the view details button, did you make those accessible in some way?
On the view details button, did I make those accessible? Okay, good question. The answer will be yes. We'll just have to look at exactly what I did here. So on the view details button, so buttons are inherently accessible. So if I am tabbing through a page, a button is going to automatically be within the tab ordering. And again, the way that I've structured the HTML layout and the DOM here, everything is by default going to be in tab order the way it appears on the screen. So you can see if I start up here, I hit tab, and I just start tabbing through, Google Maps is going to intercept a number of things, and it does some weird jumping around. But then here I've gotten to neighborhoods. Now I'm on my view details buttons, and I'm just tabbing through. And as I tab to each one of those, the screen reader is going to read those out. And if we look in how this is all set up, the way the screen reader would read this out to the user would be Superiority Burger, Manhattan, 430 East 9th Street, New York, New York 10019, button, view details. And that's pretty much all that a screen reader user needs to know. That's going to tell them exactly what this is going to do for them based on the context that they're already in. And this is always going to be about context, setting the appropriate expectations. Do we have any other questions?
How do I bypass the map for tabbing?
How do you bypass the map for tabbing? That's an interesting question. I saw this one posed on the Slack channel the other day too. My recommendation is don't. The reason being that this is still an accessible component that contains information that a non-sighted user is going to want to be able to have access to. For those of us who aren't vision impaired, we find tabbing through the map controls to be kind of a nuisance. But for them, it's actually a critical part of content on the page. And so if you skip tabbing somehow, you are excluding all of that data from them on the page. Now, if you wanted to provide them a way to give them a skip link to jump down in the page, you could do that. But I wouldn't try to exclude the map completely from the tab order. I think that would be a mistake.
Somebody asked if you could dive into a little bit about Flexbox.
Sure, Flexbox. So here's the thing. I really love Flexbox layout. If you take the React course, and for the last project in the React course, you wind up doing React Native. And React Native is completely built using Flexbox systems as well. So Flex is a very powerful tool. We could spend probably a whole hour just talking about it, but I'll give you a quick overview. So like I mentioned along the way, I'm using a couple of Flexbox systems nested inside of each other here. So I've got one that is taking all of this content, the maps, the filter, and the space for all of this display, and turning it into a column-based Flexbox. So that means everything is being stacked in a single column, top to bottom. But then within the filter results space, I've created another Flexbox set to row, and row with wrap. And so what that means is everything's going to stack in a row, left to right. And if I run out of space, then those elements are going to wrap around. And I've done the same thing with the restaurant, with restaurant tiles here too. They're stacked as a flex row, and since there are 10 of them, they're going to fit as many as they can until they hit the end of the page on the right, and then they're going to wrap around and start over and just keep going. You can do a lot of interesting things with Flex. You can have things align right, align left, spread to evenly distribute the space in between them, which is what I have going on here. So they're spreading out evenly distributed across the width of the page. You can have them alternate. So if I were to, or alternate sizing depending on the context you want to give them. So say I were to give this one a size of, and I can actually do it real quick in here. Let's say I give this one a size of Flex 2. Oh, that's not working. I'm not doing that quite right. But if I set the flex parameter on elements differently, it's basically going to compute percentages based on that. So if I said this is a 3 and this is a 2 and this is a 1, that means my total between them is 6, and 3 is half of that, and so this one would take half of the space. This one would take like 30%. So it would base them out on that. You can get a lot of interesting visual displays just by using the Flex system. And actually, if you look up the Flexbox cheat sheet on CSS tricks, I look at this a lot because I mean, all the time, And here's another thing I'll say again. I'm self-taught on a lot of this. I am constantly looking up all of the references for different things. There are so many things to learn and know about all of this material. It just takes a lot of practice, a lot more time practicing than I've had with it so far. So I usually, if I'm building out a Flex layout, I leave this page open in a tab and I'm referencing it constantly. But this is what I'm talking about. You can justify content. You can have different widths to elements. You can spread it out in all these different kinds of layouts. You can mix and match how stuff aligns vertically. It's a very powerful system to work with. It beats the pants off of your standard CSS grid system. I highly recommend getting really familiar with it.
You ready for the next one?
Yeah, I think we have time for like one question more, maybe two, depending on how fast I go.
All right, so two people asked if there was anything you can tell us on Google Maps API key security, and is it important to hide in our pushes?
Oh, interesting question. You know, it wasn't called out in this particular course, but in the Android Nanodegree course, it is very specifically called out in the submission guidelines that your API keys should always be removed from all of your code submissions. And the reason for that is it's actually a violation of terms of service in many instances to leave your API keys in the file. What I would say is leave it out, but in your README file, specify exactly where the API key needs to be placed so that the reviewer is able to look at it. And if that's not working for the reviewers for some reason, I think that's a bigger question for Udacity. But in other programs, it's definitely called out that you need to leave your API keys out of your submission.
And somebody asked if they could use Grunt to resize images for this project.
Okay, great. I think that's a good question to end on because I'll answer that question and I'll tell you how I did it. Is it okay to use Grunt? Sure, it's okay to use anything. There's nothing in the rubric that says that you have to specifically use any particular tool to resize your images. If I'm going to be honest, I resized all of my images using Photoshop. Photoshop can be automated to do that too. And since it was a small batch of images, I just did it with Photoshop. Particularly too, since I was using one aspect ratio for the tiles and a completely different aspect ratio that required some manual cropping for the banners, because I didn't just want to say always take it from this XY location with this height and width to create the banner. Artistically, some of them needed to be, cropped from different locations. So I did the cropping manually. All right. If we have one more, I know we're right at the hour, but if there are others, I would hate to leave one hanging before we close out.
While using Flexbox, do we have to specify numbers of columns to be displayed based on viewport, or does it do it by default? Oh, good question. Number of columns with Flexbox, do you have to specify them numerically, or does it do it by default? So the answer is a little bit of both. If you look at the CSS styling that I have here for the media queries. So remember, everything is in a Flexbox by default. What I've said here is from 0 pixels to 713 pixels wide, have every restaurant card be 100% width for the display. Once I get to 714, but I'm below 1032, every restaurant card should be 45%. And once I'm at 1032 or above, every restaurant card is 300 pixels exactly. So what you're doing is just telling the system how wide the card should be. And then Flexbox figures out how many of them are going to be able to fit from there. And it does it automatically. So you don't actually have to specify columns. The dimensions for your cards are going to take care of that math for you within the Flexbox system. So I think that's all we have time for now. We are just right after the hour. I am going to be around off and on throughout the weekend on the Slack channels. You can feel free to hit me up with questions there. I know that the presentation will be available again later at some point, and I hope everyone enjoys this project. I did get through it. I went through all of this a little quickly. I enjoyed doing this project. It let me play around with a few things that I was still figuring out with Flexbox and some other items. Take advantage of the opportunity, enjoy it. It's definitely something that if you put some time into over the next couple of days, you can definitely have done by Tuesday. Don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid to submit something and have it kicked back. It is not a black mark on moving forward in the program to have something come back. It just means that you have an opportunity to learn something more and then resubmit it, and everything's cool. So with that, I am going to ask Kathleen if she's still around, and we can end the broadcast.